Every king pays for his crown, and Jaehaerys Targaryen paid for his with children. They were not taken from him in battle or in fire, but quietly, over 20 years, in birthing beds and sick rooms, one at a time, while the realm around him grew richer and safer than it had ever been. It began with a plot that almost nobody remembers now. In the 50th year after the conquest, while the king was still a boy of 15, his own hand sat in a council chamber and proposed to take the throne away from him. Lord Rhaegar Baratheon insisted that he meant no murder by it. "Do you take me for a usurper?" he demanded of the men around that table. "No harm need come to Jaehaerys. We can send him away." And who would sit the Iron Throne in his place? To that, Rhaegar had an answer ready. A girl of 11, the daughter of Rhaena Targaryen and the uncrowned prince, a child who had been heir to the throne for as long as she could remember. "Princess Aerea," he said, "there is a fire in her Jaehaerys does not have. She is young, but I can continue as her hand, shape her, guide her, teach her all she needs to know." The plot collapsed within the hour, yet that same night, a dozen armed men forced their way into the girl's chambers in the Red Keep, meaning to carry her off, and found the rooms empty. Her grandmother had moved faster than they had. Remember the name, because this is her story as much as the king's. Aerea Targaryen was fought over, hidden, bargained for, and handed between grown men and women as though she were a coin that happened to breathe. In 6 years, she will climb onto the back of the largest dragon in the world and vanish from the face of the earth. And what comes back will no longer be a child. When Jaehaerys came into his power at 16, he summoned Rhaegar Baratheon back to King's Landing to answer for what he had done. The Lord of Storm's End rode for the capital expecting a headsman, and his brothers begged him to call his banners instead, but Rhaegar only laughed at them and reminded them that Harrenhal had been strong as well, and that its strength had bought Black Harren nothing at all. "I will see Jaehaerys first," he told them, "and explain myself." He found the throne room emptied of every lord and courtier who might have watched, with only the king on the Iron Throne and 7 white cloaks standing silent at its base, so that his footsteps echoed the whole long walk from the doors. "Treasonous actions deserve punishment," the young king told him. "Foolish words are another matter. If you truly desire to go to the wall, I will not stop you, but I would sooner you remain here, in my service. I would not sit upon this throne if not for you, and all the realm knows it." He pardoned the man who had tried to unseat him on conditions that Rhaegar would never speak another word against the queen and would from that day forward be her loudest champion in any hall he entered. Thunderstruck, Rhaegar asked whether the king would require hostages of him as surety, since 3 of his brothers had young children who might be sent to court. In answer, Jaehaerys came down from the throne and led him out into the yard, where a bull had been slaughtered for Vermithor's morning meal and lay charred and smoking on the stones, while the great bronze beast tore the flesh loose in chunks. They stood there together and watched the dragon eat, and the question of hostages was quietly allowed to die. Rhaegar's regency had emptied the treasury, and the king's answer to that was a Pentoshi money changer named Rhaego Draz, whom the court called the Lord of Air on the grounds that he owned no land, held no ancient title, and felt no shame about either. Within a year, the Lord of Air had the crown borrowing on better terms than any bank had meant to offer, and the building of the Dragonpit, halted for want of coin, began again. The taxes he and the king devised together fell on pepper and silk and pearls, on the things a man buys only to show the world how wealthy he is. "No man can claim to be oppressed by these taxes," Jaehaerys explained to his council. "To avoid them, a man need only forego his pepper, his silk, his pearls. The men who want these things desire them desperately, however. They may squawk, but they will pay. The whispers about his marriage to his own sister were the harder problem, and his father and his uncle had each answered such whispers with steel and dragonfire, to the ruin of them both. "Words are wind," Jaehaerys told his council, "but wind can fan a fire. We shall fight words with words, and put out the fires before they start." So he sent out 7 preachers instead of 7 knights, and where fire had failed twice in 2 generations, 7 voices succeeded in a single year. The realm did not rise. The king governed with law and coin, and his queen governed with an instrument the Iron Throne had never thought to use before. On every royal progress, Alysanne held what came to be called women's courts, where no men were admitted, and any woman of the district, high-born or low, might come forward and speak of her fears, her husband, or her lord. What she heard in those halls became law. It was there that she learned how often a man's heirs turned his widow out with nothing, and in the 52nd year, her husband proclaimed the widow's law to stop it. She was carrying their first child when they rode north that year, and they came in due course to Maidenpool, famous throughout the realm for the Sweetwater Pool where Florian the Fool was said to have first glimpsed Jonquil bathing in the Age of Heroes. The lords of the town had long ago raised a great stone bathhouse around it and given it into the keeping of an order of holy sisters, and its waters were said to heal. Like thousands of women before her, Alysanne wished to bathe in them. No men were permitted inside those walls, so Sir Joffrey Doggett and Sir Giles Morrigan took up their posts at the door while the queen went in with her ladies and her septas. Among the sisters who tended the pool were 3 whose hearts were hard with hate, and they had told one another that the holy waters would be polluted forever if the queen were allowed to bathe in them while carrying the king's abomination in her belly. Alysanne had only just slipped out of her clothing when the 3 of them came at her with daggers they had hidden in their robes. Naked and unarmed as they were, her women did not hesitate for a heartbeat, but put themselves between the blades and their queen. Septa Edith was slashed across the face, Prudence Celtigar was stabbed through the shoulder, and Rosamund Ball took a dagger in the belly that killed her 3 days later. Yet not one blade so much as touched Alysanne before the Kingsguard came running from a doorway where they had never dreamed the danger was already inside. The progress was abandoned, and they went home to the safety of Maegor's Holdfast, where the queen would remain until her child was born. The child came too early. Alysanne named him Aegon, for the Conqueror and for her own lost brother who was never crowned, and he was small and frail and lived only 3 days. Her grief was so violent that the maesters began to fear for her life as well, and for the rest of her days she knew exactly where to lay the blame. Had she been permitted to bathe in the healing waters that afternoon, she would say, had those 3 women not been waiting for her, Prince Aegon would have lived. More than a year passed before the gods gave her another, and in the 7th moon of the 53rd year, she was delivered of a daughter, strong and healthy and squalling, whom she named Daenerys. The king was at Stony Sept when the word reached him, and he was on Vermithor's back within the hour. He had wanted a son to follow him, and from the moment he first took the girl in his arms, nobody who saw them together doubted where his heart had gone. The whole realm delighted in the little princess, everywhere save on Dragonstone. The 54th year after the conquest is remembered in the chronicles by a single name. They called it the Year of the Stranger. It opened with the death of the old High Septon, and the choosing of a new one was the most dangerous thing that could happen to House Targaryen, because for 40 years, the faith had been calling the Targaryens abominations for wedding sister to brother. His council offered him the old remedies: bribes, the fleet, an army, and one quiet suggestion that this High Septon might suffer the same sudden and mysterious death that had removed another in Maegor's day. The king refused every one of them and flew to Oldtown himself with his queen. Vermithor came down on the marble plaza before the starry sept and Silverwing alighted on the high tower itself, her wings fanning the flames of the great beacon, while the whole city stood in the streets and stared. As one Archmaester wrote afterward, "The small folk cheered, the maesters nodded sagely, and the septons looked at one another and thought on dragons." It worked exactly as he had intended. The most devout raised up the high septon he wanted. Exceptionalism became a tenet of the faith, and the 40-year war between the throne and the altar was over at last. It was the greatest victory of his life, and he had held it for a matter of days when the Raven came. They were guesting at Blackhaven, listening to sad songs about star-crossed lovers, when word arrived from Storm's End that their mother was dying. Alyssa Valyrian was 44 years old and carrying Rhaegar Baratheon's second child. When the pregnancy was announced, the High Septon himself had called it a blessing from the gods, a gift from the mother above to a mother who had suffered much and bravely. But Alyssa herself had been afraid of it from the first. "I cannot suffer that again," she had told her husband, remembering the daughter she bore King Aenys, who died in her cradle. "It would rip my heart apart." Vermithor and Silverwing took the sky, and they found her at the top of the great drum tower, asleep in a bed that stank of urine, drenched in sweat, and gaunt as a crone, save for her swollen belly. Outside the chamber door, Rhaegar Baratheon sat drunk and despairing, and when the king demanded to know why he was not with his wife, the Lord of Storm's End growled at him. "The stranger's in that room. I can smell him." The midwife did not soften any of it. Something had torn inside the queen. She was too old to have the strength to push, and the child was turned the wrong way, so that both of them would be gone by first light. Maester Kyrie offered the only thing he had left to offer, which was that he might save the child by cutting the mother open, and that the babe might live or might not, while the woman would certainly die. Alysanne wept at that. The king said only, "The woman is my mother and a queen." And then he went out into the corridor, pulled Rhaegar Baratheon to his feet, dragged him back into the birthing chamber, and made the maester repeat every word of it. "She is your wife," Jaehaerys told him. "It is for you to say the words." Rhaegar could not bring himself to look at her, and could not find his voice at all until the king took him by the arm and shook him. "Save my son," he said at last, and then wrenched free and fled the room, and Maester Kyrie bowed his head and sent for his blades. Many of the accounts that have come down to us say that Alyssa woke before he could begin, and wept with joy to see her children standing there, and gave her blessing to what was about to happen. "Save my babe," she is supposed to have whispered. "I will go to see my boys again. The crone will light my way." Other accounts, less pleasant to believe, say she never woke at all. On one point every version agrees, that Alysanne held her mother's hand from the first cut to the last, and did not let go of it until the child's first cry filled the room. Rhaegar did not get the second son he had prayed for. The child was a girl, born so small and weak that neither maester nor midwife believed she would see the morning, and she surprised them both, as she would go on surprising people for the rest of her life. When he had recovered himself enough to think about it, her father named her Jocelyn. Dawn was breaking, and the queen's body was not yet cold when Vermithor lifted his head in the yard and roared, having scented another dragon on the wind, and Dreamfire came down out of the red morning sky. Rhaena Targaryen had flown through the night to make amends with her mother. She had come too late, as she seemed fated always to come too late. Her brother told her she had no need to look upon their mother's remains, and she insisted, and tore away the bedclothes to see for herself what the maester's blades had done. Then she went down to the great hall, where Rhaegar sat with his infant son on his knee, surrounded by his brothers, and she pushed through all of them to stand over him. "Her blood is on your hands," she told him. "May you die screaming. She gave you one son. That should have been enough. Save my wife, you should have said." but what are wives to men like you?" When she had stormed out to her dragon, Rogar and his brothers shared a laugh over it, and then he called for wine and sent word inviting the king and queen to stay on for a feast in honor of his daughter. Jaehaerys had won his peace with the faith at last, and he would remember that year for the rest of his life as the year the victory turned to ashes in his mouth. The king's own sister carried a grievance of her own, and hers had been festering for the better part of a decade. Rhaena Targaryen had been the wife of 2 kings and the sister of a third, had been forced into marriage with the uncle who burned her husband out of the sky, and when it was all over, she had been left holding nothing that belonged to her, without a seat of her own, or lands of her own, or any place in the world where a single soul owed her anything. Her brother offered her a home at court, and she would not have it. "And live forever in your shadow?" she asked him. "I need a seat of my own, a place where no lord may threaten me, banish me, or trouble those I have taken under my protection. I need lands, men, a castle." When he told her gently that every castle in the realm was occupied, she had her answer ready. "All the lands are taken, all the castles occupied," she agreed. "But there is one I have a claim to, a better claim than your own, brother. I am the blood of the dragon." She meant Dragonstone, the ancient seat of their house, and Jaehaerys, who had grown up on that island and been crowned in its shadow, gave it to her without argument. Then she asked him for one thing more. "Aerea," she said, "I want my daughter restored to me." And the king said, "Done," far more quickly than he should have, because Aerea Targaryen was a girl of 8, and still his acknowledged successor, heir apparent to the Iron Throne, and he handed her over without a council, without a condition, and without a moment's thought. The consequences of that single word would take years to arrive. The reunion went badly from the first hour, since the princess had no memory of her mother, and the queen had no knowledge of her child, nor any great fondness for children generally. Aerea had been raised in the Red Keep, in a court that adored her, among lords and ladies and envoys from strange foreign lands coming and going, with knights training in the yards every morning, and singers and mummers and fools capering by night, and all the clangor of King's Landing roaring away beyond the walls. More than that, she had been the heir, praised and courted by great lords and gallant knights and washerwomen and stableboys alike, running a pack of girls of high birth and low who terrorized the castle from the cellars to the rookery. All of it was taken from her in a single afternoon by a mother she did not know, and she was carried off to an island she had never asked to see. Set beside King's Landing, Dragonstone was a dull gray place, sleepy and quiet, with no girls of her own age in the castle, and no permission to mix with the daughters of the fisherfolk in the village below the walls. Her mother was a stranger to her, stern one day and shy the next, and always brooding. And the women who surrounded the queen took no interest in the child at all. There was one exception among them, and that exception is the reason this story ends the way it does. Her name was Alyssa Farman, of Fair Isle, and she was no lady of the court, but a sailor who had spent her life at sea. She told the princess stories of her voyages and promised to teach her how to handle a boat. And she was the only person on that island who spoke to Aerea as though the girl were worth speaking to. Alyssa was no happier on Dragonstone than the child was, however. She missed her wide western seas and spoke often of going back to them, and every time she did, Aerea would ask to be taken along, and Alyssa Farman would only laugh. There was one thing the island had that King's Landing lacked. In the great citadel beneath the shadow of the Dragon Mount, dragons were hatching almost every time the moon turned, and Rhaena made certain her daughter was introduced to them. "Choose one and make him yours," the queen told her, "and one day you will fly." Older dragons dozed in the yards, and beyond the walls the wild ones that had escaped the castle laired in hidden caves on the far side of the mountain. At court, the girl had known Vermithor and Silverwing by sight without ever being allowed near them. And here she could visit as often as she liked. The hatchlings, the young drakes, her mother's dream fire, and greatest of them all, huge and ancient and sleepy but still terrifying when they woke and stirred and spread their wings, Vhagar and Balerion. On Dragonstone, the dragons became her friends, and in time they became her only friends. Then, in the 53rd year, word came across the water from King's Landing that the queen had been delivered of a daughter, and that the realm had a new heir. "Why should she be queen?" the girl demanded, when Alysanne came and tried to speak kindly to her about it. "I should be queen, not her." Her aunt tried everything she could think of, and told her about her own girlhood, and how Rhaena had once put a dragon's egg into her cradle and cared for her as though she were her mother. "She never gave me anything," the princess answered. When the girl finally broke, she wept and begged to be taken back with her aunt to the capital. "Lady Alyssa said that she would take me, but she went away and forgot me. I want to come back to court with the singers and the knights." Rhaena refused her flatly. "You have my throne," she told her sister. "Content yourself with that. You shall not have my daughter too." That same night, mother and daughter screamed at one another loudly enough for the sound to carry through the stone drum, and after that the princess would not speak to Queen Alysanne at all. So the queen went home to her husband and her infant daughter, and left an 11-year-old girl on a gray island with a mother who did not want her, a throne that had been given away without asking her, and a mountain full of dragons. Alyssa Farman did not leave quietly, and she did not leave empty-handed. She went with 3 of Dreamfire's eggs hidden in her baggage, stolen from the queen's own dragon, and she sold them across the narrow sea to pay for the thing she actually wanted. That thing was a ship. She made her way to Braavos, whose shipwrights are the finest in the world, and had one built there, and named her the Sun Chaser, and took her west past the sunset into the empty ocean where no charts go, looking for whatever might lie on the other side of the world. When she came to say her farewells, the princess wept and clung to her leg, and begged to be allowed to come, saying she wanted to sail the seas and have adventures. Alyssa shed a tear of her own, we are told, and then pushed the girl gently away and went. Rhaena received the news of the theft without much expression. Her brother's reaction was of an entirely different order. "Should the dragons turn up, anywhere from here to Yi Ti," Jaehaerys said, "we will demand their return. They were stolen from us, they are ours by right. If that demand should be denied, then we must needs go and get them. Take them back if we can, kill them if not." And then, more quietly, he said the thing that was really troubling him. "I will not allow Valyria to rise again. Imagine what the Triarchs of Volantis would do with dragons. Let us pray it never comes to that." He gave orders that the eggs be hunted for, and Rhaego Draz set his agents and informers to work in every port up and down the narrow sea. That network of spies is worth remembering because within 3 years it will be given a very different quarry. On Dragonstone, meanwhile, the only person who had ever promised to take Aerea Targaryen away from that island had just sailed off the edge of the map without her, and the girl had spent 2 years learning that there was another way off a rock in the middle of the sea. In the 56th year after the conquest, Dreamfire came down on the Red Keep in the middle of the day, and Rhaena Targaryen flung herself off the dragon's back before it had properly settled and came through the doors of Maegor's Holdfast, shouting for her brother and her sister. Her daughter was gone. Aerea had slipped out at dawn, walked into the yards and claimed a dragon of her own, and not one of the hatchlings her mother had offered her. "Balerion!" Rhaena told them. "She took Balerion, the mad child! No hatchling for her!" It is worth understanding what that meant. Balerion was the dragon Aegon the Conqueror rode to make a kingdom out of 7, the beast whose fire melted Harrenhal into slag with Black Heron and his sons inside it. and the dragon that had killed Aerea's own father in the sky above the god's eye. A girl not yet 13, who had never ridden a dragon in her life, had climbed onto the back of the largest living creature in the world and taken him into the air. The ravens flew that same hour, and there was no word of her that day, nor the day after, nor the day after that. Rhaena stayed on at the Red Keep through all of it, raging 1 hour and shaking the next, drinking sweet wine in order to sleep at all, and little Princess Daenerys grew so frightened of her aunt that she hid from her. Then she took Dreamfire and went to look herself, flying the length of the realm, to Fair Isle where she had once been a girl, to Casterly Rock, to Old Town where her other daughter lived as a septa in the Starry Sept, to every place a runaway child might think to go. Nowhere in all of Westeros had anyone seen a dragon in the sky save her own. The king blamed himself and said so openly, admitting that he had taken little notice of Aerea even in the years when she was his heir, but it was the dragon that he could not make sense of. A riderless dragon returns to its lair, and Balerion had not returned to his. So the search widened, and the agents Rhaego Draz had set hunting for the stolen eggs were given a new task, to find the princess and the Black Dread. Reports came in from every port on the narrow sea, and nearly all of them were lies told for the sake of the reward. Alysanne prayed for her niece every morning and every night, and blamed herself for the child's flight, and blamed her sister a great deal more. "If the girl were dead, I would know it," the queen insisted. "She is still alive, I feel it." A year went by that way. Then, on a cold, gray morning with a hard wind blowing out of the east, a shadow fell across the yards of the Red Keep. Balerion came down into the inner ward with his huge wings buffeting the air, and a figure slid from his back before he had well settled, and every man who had known the princess in her years at court failed to recognize her. Her clothing hung on her in rags and tatters, her hair was tangled and matted, and her arms and legs were as thin as sticks. "Please!" she cried out to the knights and squires running toward her across the stones, and then said only, "I never," before she collapsed. Ser Lucamore Strong reached her first and carried her across the castle to Grand Maester Bennifer, and afterward he told anyone who would listen that the girl had been burning, that he could feel the heat of her through the enameled scale of his armor, and that there was blood in her eyes. He said, too, that there was something inside her, something moving that made her shudder and twist in his arms as he ran. He did not tell that story for long, because the next day the king sent for him and commanded him never to speak of it again. The king and queen had been sent for at once, and when they reached the maester's chambers, Bennifer stood in the doorway and refused to let them through it. "You do not want to see her like this," he told them, "and I would be remiss if I allowed you any closer." Guards were posted to keep the servants away as well, and only Septon Barth was admitted to administer the rites for the dying. Bennifer did what he could with milk of the poppy and then with a tub of ice to bring the fever down. Hundreds crowded into the sept to pray for her while the king and queen kept vigil in a corridor outside a closed door, and they were never allowed to see their niece alive. She died a few hours after the sun went down. At sunrise, she was given to the flames with her body wrapped from head to toe in fine white linen, and Grand Maester Bennifer, who had prepared her for the pyre, looked half dead himself. The king announced that his niece had died of a fever and asked the realm to pray for her, and King's Landing mourned for a few days before life resumed as before. That was the end of it for everyone except the two men who had been in that room, neither of whom ever slept properly again. Grand Maester Bennifer wrote a great deal in the course of his life, and his letters, journals, and court calendars are among the fullest records any Grand Maester has left us. About the night Princess Aerea died, he wrote nothing whatsoever. Septon Barth did write it down, and then sealed the pages away among his private papers, where they went unread for a very long time. "It has been 3 days since the princess perished, and I have not slept," he began. "I do not know that I shall ever sleep again. The mother is merciful, I have always believed, and the Father above judges each man justly. But there was no mercy and no justice in what befell our poor princess. How could the gods be so blind or so uncaring as to permit such horror? Or is it possible that there are other deities in this universe, monstrous, evil gods, against whose malice the kings of men and the gods of men are naught but flies?" Then he set down what he had actually seen in that room, and it has never once been read aloud kindly. "We have told the world that Princess Aerea died of a fever, and that is broadly true. But it was a fever such as I have never seen before and hope never to see again." The girl was burning. When I laid my hand upon her brow to learn how hot she was, it was as if I had thrust it into a pot of boiling oil. There was scarce an ounce of flesh upon her bones, and yet we could observe certain swellings inside her, as her skin bulged out and then sank down again. There were things inside her, living things, moving and twisting, mayhaps searching for a way out. All the maester's arts proved useless against it, and when the two of them lowered her into the tub of ice, the shock stopped her heart at once, which Barth told himself afterward had been a mercy, because that was the moment the things inside her came out. Whatever they might have been, they were creatures of heat and fire, and they did not love the ice. One after another they thrashed and writhed and died before my eyes. I will not presume to give them names. They were horrors. Some days later he came back to the page and asked the question that everyone else had been asking backwards. Where did Aerea Targaryen go after fleeing Dragonstone? It seems to me that we have all been asking the wrong question. From the very start we have asked, where did Aerea take Balerion? We should have been asking, where did Balerion take Aerea? It is one thing to leap onto a dragon's back, as Barth pointed out, and quite another to bend him to your will, and nobody living had ever bent the Black Dread to anything. Balerion was also older than any creature had a right to be. Vhagar and Meraxes had hatched on Dragonstone, but Balerion alone had crossed the sea as a hatchling with Enar the Exile and Daenys the Dreamer, 12 years before the Doom, which made him very likely the only living thing in the world that had ever seen Valyria whole. And that is where he took the poor doomed child clinging to his back. If she went willingly, I would be most surprised, but she had neither the knowledge nor the force of will to turn him. Valyria, where the dragon lords had practiced blood magic and worse, delving deep into the earth for secrets best left buried, and twisting the flesh of beasts and men into monstrous and unnatural things. Valyria is accursed, all men agree, but we would be mistaken to believe that nothing lives there now. The things we found inside Aerea Targaryen live there now. There was one further piece of evidence, and it was the size of a castle wall. Balerion had come home wounded. The most fearsome dragon ever to fly over Westeros bore half-healed scars that no man recalled ever having seen on him before, and down his left side ran a jagged rent almost 9 feet long, a gaping wound from which his blood still dripped, hot and smoking. Something on that dead continent had fought the Black Dread and opened him up. Barth closed his account with a line he never afterward took back. "It is my own abiding sin that whenever I come upon a door I must needs see what lies upon the farther side. But certain doors are best left unopened. Aerea Targaryen went through such a door." He never wrote of her again in all his years. Later that same year, the king issued a royal edict forbidding any ship suspected of having visited the Valyrian Islands or sailed the Smoking Sea from landing at any port or harbor in the Seven Kingdoms, and forbidding his own subjects from going there at all, on pain of death. Not long after, Balerion became the first of the Targaryen dragons to be housed in the Dragonpit, in brick-lined tunnels sunk deep into the hill of Rhaenys and fashioned after the manner of caves, 5 times the size of the lairs on Dragonstone. 3 younger dragons soon joined the Black Dread beneath the hill, while Vermithor and Silverwing remained at the Red Keep, close to their riders. To make certain that no child would ever again walk into a yard and simply take a dragon, Jaehaerys decreed that every dragon in the realm be guarded night and day, wherever it happened to lair, and a new order was created for that single purpose. They numbered 77 men, and the realm came to know them as the Dragonkeepers. By the time the Raven found Rhaena Targaryen, her daughter had already died and already burned, so that only ashes and bone were left for her mother to collect. "It would seem that I am doomed to always come too late," she said. The king offered to have the ashes interred on Dragonstone, beside Aegon the Conqueror and the other dead of their house, and she refused him. She hated Dragonstone, she reminded him. She wanted to fly. So she carried her child's ashes high into the sky on Dreamfire and scattered them on the wind. Dragonstone was still hers if she wanted it, her brother told her, and she wanted nothing to do with it. "There is nothing there for me now but grief and ghosts." In the end, he found her the most unlikely seat in all of Westeros. He gave her Harrenhal, Black Heron's ruin, the castle their own grandfather had melted into slag with the very dragon her daughter died on. And so, Rhaena Targaryen, daughter of 1 king, wife to 2, and sister to a 3rd, spent the last years of her life in its widow's tower. She never returned to King's Landing, and she never returned to Dragonstone, and she played no further part in the ruling of the realm. Her hair of gold and silver turned white before the end, and the small folk of the Riverlands came to fear her as a witch. The fortunate among the travelers who came to her gates caught a glimpse of her on the battlements, alone. She died there at 50 years of age, and at her pyre her brother said the truest thing anyone ever said about her. "My brother Aegon died at the hands of our uncle in the battle beneath the God's Eye. His wife, my sister Rhaena, was not with him at the battle, but she died that day as well." Then the winter of the 59th year came down on Westeros, and brought something with it out of the east. The maesters called it the Shivers. It came up the Blackwater and into the capital, and nowhere in all the realm was hit as hard as King's Landing, where the dead came to include 2 knights of the Kingsguard. One of the great men lost that winter, though, was not taken by the plague at all. Rhaego Draz had never taken up residence in the Red Keep, despite the king's repeated offers, preferring his own manse on the Street of Silk, where he could entertain his concubines without suffering the disapproval of the court. 10 years of service had made him stout enough that he no longer cared to ride, so he moved from manse to castle in an ornate gilded palanquin, and his route took him through the reeking heart of Flea Bottom. On that day, a dozen of the district's less savory denizens were chasing a piglet down an alley when they came upon him. They were drunk, they were hungry, the piglet had escaped them, and to a man, they held the master of coin to blame for the price of bread. They swarmed the palanquin, drove off his bearers, and spilled his lordship onto the ground. And onlookers said he screamed for help in words that none of them understood. When he raised his hands to ward off the blows, gold and gemstones glittered on every finger, and the attack grew more frenzied still. A woman shouted that he was Pentashi, that his kind had brought the Shivers here, and one of the men pried a stone up out of the king's newly cobbled street and brought it down on his head again and again until there was nothing left to bring it down upon. So died the Lord of Air, his skull crushed by one of the very cobblestones he had helped the king to lay. Jaehaerys rode out himself with his Kingsguard around him to claim the body, and one of those knights said afterward that when he looked at the king's face in that street, for a moment it was as if he were looking at his uncle. The Shivers had not finished with House Targaryen. Princess Daenerys was 6 years old when she woke her mother in the night to say that she felt cold. Everything that could be done for anyone was done for her. prayers and poultices, hot soups and scalding baths, blankets and furs, and hot stones and nettle tea. A wet nurse was summoned because some still believed that mother's milk could cure it. The king ordered 100 new rat catchers hired at once and offered a silver stag for every dead rat brought to him. She asked for her kitten, and her kitten was brought to her, and as her shivering grew more violent, it squirmed out of her grasp and scratched her hand. Near dawn, Jaehaerys came to his feet, shouting that his daughter must have a dragon, that a dragon would save her, and ravens went out to Dragonstone, ordering the Dragonkeepers to bring a hatchling to the Red Keep at once. A day and a half after she first complained of the cold, the little princess died, and none of it had mattered in the slightest. The queen collapsed in her husband's arms and shook so violently that some in the room feared she had taken the shivers herself. The king flew to Dragonstone in person to tell them there was no need for the hatchling after all, and when he returned, he drank a cup of dream wine and sent for Septon Barth. "How could this happen?" he demanded of him. "What sin did she commit? Why would the gods take her? How could this happen?" And Barth, the wisest man in the 7 kingdoms, the man who had worked out for himself what still lives in the ruins of Valyria, had no answer for him at all. 3 children were gone by then: Aegon, who lived 3 days, Aerea, who flew too far, and Daenerys, who was 6 years old and clever and was going to be a great queen. The Golden Age was not finished taking. Jaehaerys and Alysanne would have 13 children in all, and the ones who lived would break the good queen's heart far more thoroughly than the ones who died. Next time on Fire and Blood, 3 daughters, 2 quarrels that split the king from his queen, and a question of succession that would one day set the whole world to war. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.